Into Genesis chapter 3. We're going to be there for a moment, but just to recap, Mark kicked us off the series where we looked at that there is in fact a gap between what we think about ourselves and actually how God sees us. And that gap is called the identity gap. I don't know if many of you would have been on the tube where it says mind the gap. There is sometimes a gap between how we see ourselves and how God sees us. And this series is all about closing that gap between how I see myself and how God sees me. The truth is that many people will say, well, it's my truth how I see myself. The problem is it's not the truth. And the truth comes from the Word. It comes from the authority of the Scriptures. And we need to look at what the Scriptures say about who we are. There's a famous theologian that once said, the most important wisdom in the world is the knowledge of self and a knowledge of God. Isn't that true? And it seems like as soon as we've drifted away from a knowledge of God, we've drifted away what it means to be human, and our identity has been confused. So Genesis 1:27, we looked at this last week, but we're going to unpack a little bit more about what it says. Genesis 1:27, so God created human beings in His own image. In the image of God, He created them. So I bought a mirror here, not to stare at myself, right? This is a mirror we have in our house that shows my face now and then of whether I need to, pull myself together. And I was using this mirror the other day to reflect a little spot on the ground for Isla to run around. If you don't know Isla, she's my little 4-year-old, and she was chasing it a bit afterwards. Actually, it was coming from my watch. There was a reflection. But if I reflected it the wrong way, the spot of light would disappear. So I'm going to try this now. I'm going to shine it in Mark's eyes. Hopefully he can, is it shining in your, not yet? Not yet? If I get the angle right? There we go. Okay, let's not blind him any moment. But I thought about doing it with a laser, but health and safety rather than not, right? But you have to get almost the angle quite right to begin to reflect it to someone else. Being an image bearer is a little bit like that. We are created in God's image, and it's like we are that mirror that reflects Him to the rest of the world. And the great thing is when we reflect Him to the rest of the world, we also reflect back to Him. It's our relationship with Him. But if we get that angle slightly wrong, the light stops. You see, I think for a lot of us, when it says that we're made an image bearer, it means we are meant to reflect God's glory and majesty into the world. That's what it means to be an image bearer. And that's actually what it means to worship. Now, some of you might say, how is that worship? And I want to start with this first point. You and I were created to worship. That's part of our identity, is that you and I were created to be image bearers and reflect to God. Now, for some of you, you've said, no, we just worship just now. 25 minutes, some people raised their hands, some people clapped, some were on time. Not everyone, I wasn't on time, right? But some people have reduced worship to simply a 25-minute activity on Sunday. I don't know about you, but sometimes I get it wrong. I say, okay, let's all stand and worship together. The problem is that that's one part of worship, but it's not all of worship. This is what Millard Erickson, he's a great Christian theologian, he says this: every human being is God's creature made in God's own image. God blessed each of us with the powers of personality that make it possible for us to worship and serve Him. Being an image bearer means we are created to worship, created to reflect Him. When using those powers to those ends, we are most, and here's this line that I'd love you to almost embrace. It's a great line. When using those powers to those ends, we are most fully what God intended us to be and then are most completely human. That is a statement. The statement that when they are not used in that way, we are less than human. It's like this image begins to reflect something else. To be human is to worship. Worship is core to who we are. We were created to be orientated toward God and to reflect Him to the world. It's like, an object, the planet circulating the sun. It's like our whole lives were meant to revolve around them. And as we do that, we reflect Him to the rest of the world. That is at its core what it means to be human. It means to worship. Paul puts it like this, Romans 12 verse 1, "Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view," that's like the angle. He's like, get the angle right. "In view of God's mercy, to offer not your singing, not your 25 minutes, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice. Holy and pleasing to God." This is your true and proper worship. I don't know about you, but sacrifice is not a pleasant word, is it? You don't throw yourself on the altar and think, wow, this is a great king-size bed, right? It's really at that moment when we realize, actually, it's going to cost us something to remain in view of God. And as we do that, it becomes worship to the world. Paul's saying that when our angle is right towards God, when we orientate our feelings, our emotions, our identity, and that becomes our act of worship. C.S. Lewis, some of you will know, I'll quote him a lot because I think he's a profound theologian, but he said something really interesting in his little book called Screwtape Letters. Now, if you haven't read it, it's an interesting book. He pretends to be a demon, and they plot against the church and other Christians. And they write letters to each other, to fellow demons. It's quite a thing to get your head around. But he's got this little line that one of the demons says, he, talking about God, really does want to fill the universe with a lot of loathsome little replicas of himself. That's what God is intended to do. It's like those hundreds of little mirrors that are meant to reflect Him to the rest of the world. But something happened. Something happened, and Genesis 3 is possibly one of the most pivotal, important chapters in the entire Bible. It describes everything that is wrong with our world. It describes what's wrong with, I don't know about you, but it's been quite hot recently. It describes what happened when creation fell. It described what happened when you and I fell. But this is actually essentially what happened, is that the enemy came in and decided to try disrupt God replicating Himself into the world. Genesis 3 verse 1 to 5. "The serpent was the shrewdest of all wild animals the Lord God had made. One day he asked the woman, 'Did God really say?'" Quite a statement. "Did God really say, 'You must not eat the fruit from any of the trees of the garden?' 'Of course we may eat fruit from the trees of the garden,' the woman replied. 'It's only the fruit from the tree in the middle of the garden that we are not allowed to eat. God says you must not eat it or even touch it, or you will die.' 'You won't die,' the serpent replied to the woman. 'God knows that your eyes will be open, and as soon as you eat it, you'll be like God, knowing both good and evil.'" Last week, we looked at the fact that God had already made them in His likeness. But now the enemy slightly distorts that and say, you know what, you need an upgrade. I don't know about you, but always when the new iPhone comes out, your old one starts to play up, doesn't it? It's kind of like this moment right here. There's this moment when Satan says, you need a bit of an upgrade here. This is the second point. You and I become what we worship. It's this lie that comes into the garden, and from then on, all of destruction and death enters the world. To make, what Satan does here is, he's actually very crafty. It says that he knows what he cannot do is say to our first parents, Adam and Eve, stop worshiping. Stop worshiping God. Stop reflecting Him. He knows that he can't do that. But what he simply does is change the angle. Changes the angle, misdirects it, and stops reflecting the sun, and almost like instead turns it inwardly. Reflect yourself. The only problem is that you and I cannot stop worshiping. It's not the question of whether we will worship God or not. It's that we will always worship. It's just what we are worshiping. You and I cannot not worship. The enemy's big strategy here is just to manipulate, adjust, and shift that so the light stops and goes inwardly. The root of all sin, the root of the problem of every part of what we see in the world as evil, is that it is an issue of worship. Paul in Romans 1 verse 25 says, "For although they knew God, they neither glorified Him or reflected Him as God, nor give thanks to Him. But their thinking became futile. Their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images. Therefore God gave them over to their sinful desires, sexual impurity, for the degrading of their bodies. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served created things rather than Creator, who is forever praised." 2 Corinthians 17:15, they followed worthless idols, and they themselves become worthless. Now, you might say here, well, Tristan, I don't worship. I don't see myself every single day. My Monday doesn't look like worship. The truth is, whatever we attach our value and our worth to becomes our worship. I don't know if you remember Lance Armstrong, not Neil Armstrong. He stepped on the moon. Lance Armstrong climbed on a bike, right? Mark only found that funny. Thanks, Mark. And do you remember that moment when this was one of the greatest moments in cycling history, was Lance Armstrong's achievements? Do you remember when we found out about the doping scandal? Do you remember that? It was suddenly like devastating. Everything we had attached to this man's achievement suddenly came, stripped him of that. And Lance Armstrong had an identity crash. He was known for his achievements, and yet in a single moment, all of it disappeared. The truth is that you and I might not have the awards like Lance Armstrong, but if we measure our value by what we've achieved, our pedigree, our surname, who we've been with, our wife, our kind of what we've accumulated in life, and if that was stripped away, would there be anything left of you? Christine Everett was a famous pro tennis player, and when she retired, she really struggled with this. She said, "I had no idea who I was away from tennis. Winning made me feel like I was somebody. It was like being hooked on a drug." I don't know about you, but there are things in my own life that if I begin to think, wow, this is really working out, people praise me, I begin to attach my value or my identity on that, don't we? It can be anything. Our achievements can become idols. Our career can become idols. And one of the saddest tragedies is when that's stripped away and people feel like life is not worth living anymore. The 2008 financial crisis, the amount of people that committed suicide after severe financial loss, it's like everything they had built up was suddenly away, and they thought, well, I have no more value anymore. Many things can become idols, and what begins to happen is we begin to worship them, and this is how we worship them. Worship is when we take the things in our life and we begin to make sacrifices for those things. So if it's a career, we put our time on there, we put our family on that altar, and we sacrifice it to achieve greater things, and before we've known it, we've made symbolic sacrifices to that God that we are chasing. You and I worship. You and I, no matter if you're not a believer in God here, you are worshiping something or someone. So how do we make this more applicable? How can we identify idols? And I just want you to know that there are times in my life when I slip into that sometimes as well. Begin to shift away from who God has called me and what He said over my life, and I begin to attach my value to other things. Tim Keller in his book says, here are 4 questions you can ask yourself, and I don't want you to answer them now, but let's just think about these questions soberly. What does your mind return to in moments of silence? When you wake up at 3 a.m., what are you going through? Where does your money flow without restraint? What produces despair when lost? What provokes your most uncontrollable emotions? When you find yourself almost so brimming sensitively that if something happens, you feel like you will react. What is that thing? Maybe it's your reputation. Maybe it's something that someone criticized. Where do your emotions suddenly flare up and you realize that's an idol? Someone once said, if you pull your emotions up by the roots, you'll find your idols clinging to the bottom. Isn't that a good image? A couple of men helped me the other day pull up a couple of weeds in our garden. They were a great help. And there was this particular one that I had tried to poison and get out, and it still wouldn't come up. But I knew at the bottom of those roots is where I needed to get to. And I think these questions help us get to the bottom of those roots to make sure that our identity and security is in God Himself, not in our own things or the things of this world. We've just moved into a place down the road, and one of the things I've been trying to figure out is IKEA. We don't have IKEA in South Africa. And opened a box, and there are, like 1 million screws and various things. I'm watching YouTube, and I think, okay, now I've got the DIY skills of a gnat, so, Caroline's busy on other things, so she can't help me. Her DIY skills are far better than mine. And I remember just the screw wouldn't go in. And just forcing it in, and eventually taking drills and hammers, and everyone's like, you don't need drills and hammers with IKEA. Like, it's meant to just fit. And I was like, this is not fitting in. They made a mistake. And so I'm hammering it in, and eventually you just hear that split of wood. The problem is, what begins to happen is worshiping of created things rather than our Creator seems like it's a good idea. And then something happens, and you hear a crack in your life. You realize you're damaging yourself. I think one of the saddest things that happens after Adam and Eve succumbed to temptation is that they tried to clothe themselves, and yet God had created them with worthiness and dignity from the beginning. They suddenly felt like they needed to cover themselves. But here's the great news, is that it doesn't end in despair with us worshiping the wrong things. Jesus steps in, and He almost helps us gaze that mirror back to God the Father. And here's the most beautiful thing about Jesus. When He comes in, He was the perfect one who never sinned. And He said, anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. Hebrews 1 verse 3, the Son, talking about Jesus, radiates God's own glory and expresses the very character of God. If you want to know what God is like, you look to Jesus, the full expression of the Father. He is God Himself. It's indistinguishable. You can't separate. It's a great mystery. Fully God and fully man. He was the true image bearer. And you know what He comes to do? He comes to restore us back to the Father, so that you and I can mirror Him back to the world. He comes to set us free from our idols. You and I can't stop worshiping created things. We need someone to come and rescue us and help us worship God Himself. And here's the beautiful thing, is that Jesus comes, and as we behold Him, as we look at Him, and that's why we always say we want to look at Jesus each and every single week, because as we see Him, we are turned into His image. This is what 2 Corinthians 3 verse 16 to 18 says, but whenever anyone turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. What happens when we worship created things, they entrap us. But here, when we worship who we were designed to worship, there brings freedom. And we all, with unveiled faces, contemplate the Lord's glory, are being transformed. It's like we are being slowly better angled, being transformed into His image, into an ever-increasing glory which comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. The Son comes, and what He does is He enables us to see what God is like, for us to worship Him. But here's how He rescued us, is He Himself was distorted on the cross so that you and I can become image bearers of God. On the cross, He was so disfigured by the punishment that He took for us that actual fact He restores us to being image bearers again. I want to end off with this image, and then we're going to worship Him again by singing. Is that there are a couple of logos on the screen, right? I think we may have had an image of logos. Yeah. Does anyone recognize those logos? Yes. Okay. First one is Apple. Well done. Well done. Okay. They're the same here in the UK. I didn't realize that. Okay. But what if I said that logo was Coca-Cola? You'd say, no, you're wrong. But I'm like, but that's just a drawing. It's just a symbol. That could mean anything. But it represents the value of the company. And even though that's just a drawing, I can't start a business with that logo and put it on. There would be a whole bunch of trademark issues. But here's what God does, is that He takes us by His Son, rescues us, and we again represent Him who we were designed to represent. That's why when we come together as a church, it's beautiful, because you and I are representing the Father to each other. You've got Christ inside of you, and it's almost like you are the logo of God that represents Him to each other. Jesus did it perfectly. We're not perfect in any way, but as we stare at Him, we are transformed more into who He's designed us to be. I think that deserves worshiping Him now and singing. So I wonder if we could all please stand, if the band could come on up.